have like a book study, but to kind of learn how to actually engage in spiritual warfare in the sort of ordinary manner in which we all need to do. All right, and so we start with letter four, and letter four is pretty much all about prayer. Okay, and so we'll spend a lot of time today talking about this particular letter, going a little deeper into it. Um, and it's sort of interesting because the way that Lewis portrays this, I think, is really good. How he talks about the demons talking about prayer being painful for them, and so the ideas he has here, I think, are really good because it sort of goes into all of the ways in which the devil uh, kind of is powerless against prayer, um, like to the point where he's trying to actually get you not to pray, and all the ways in which he does, kind of tricks us and gets us caught up in ourselves, caught at watching ourselves rather than talking to God. And so we're going to talk about each one of those ideas today. All right, and so um, so here I think is like the basically the summary of the entire letter. It says the best thing where it is possible is to keep the patient from serious intention of praying altogether. This is best done by encouraging him to remember or to think he remembers the parrot-like nature of his prayers in childhood. In reaction against that, he may be persuaded to aim at something entirely spontaneous, inward, informal, and unregularized. And what this will actually mean to a beginner will be an effort to produce in himself a vaguely devotional mood in which real concentration of will and intelligence have no part. One of their poets, Coleridge, has recorded that he did not pray with moving lips and bended knees, but merely composed his spirit to love and indulged a sense of supplication. This is exactly the sort of prayer we want. And since it bears a superficial resemblance to the prayer of silence, as practiced by those who are very far advanced in the enemy's service, clever and lazy patients can be taken in by it for quite a long time. All right. So what I want to do with this, okay, this is this to me, I think one of the first times that I read Screwtape Letters. This particular, I guess because of where I was, this particular paragraph hit me really hard, and really forced me to start to really learn the mechanics of prayer. Um, because as we've talked about before, uh, very often, especially in the church, we assume people know how to pray, and we just set them off and like, go pray about it. And we never really school people in prayer. And I think when I first read this, that sort of idea was pretty pretty profound to me. All of a sudden, I was like, well, I thought I was praying. I thought this was prayer. I really don't know what the heck I'm doing. And so um, what I want to do then is to sort of talk about a little bit about the levels of prayer. And we touched a little bit last week on Saint John of the Cross. We'll spend a little more time this week on Saint Teresa of Avila. Um, Saint John of the Cross, I think I mentioned this last week, is he's more of a theologian. Um, and so he uses sort of big words, and he kind of goes sort of discursively through prayer, whereas Saint Teresa of Avila is much more accessible in that she uses a lot of imagery, and she uses a lot of common sense, and she kind of goes, sort of breaks her categories up a little bit better. So I think she's a little bit more accessible, um, I mean, especially to me, and hopefully to you as well. So we'll be using her quite a bit this week. Okay, all right. So if you don't know, the fourth section of the Catechism has some really good stuff on prayer. All right, and it goes through all the ways in which to pray, all the steps of prayer, all the levels of prayer, um, and it opens with just this image of prayer as this place where God's thirst collides with our thirst. So God's thirst for souls collides with our thirst for God. Okay, and it says, if you knew the gift of God. Okay, so it's using the imagery of Jesus with the woman at the well. If you knew the gift of God, the wonder of prayer is revealed beside the well where we come seeking water. There, Christ comes to meet every human being. It is He who first seeks us and asks us for a drink. Jesus thirsts. His asking arises from the depths of God's desire for us. Whether we realize it or not, prayer is the encounter of God's thirst with ours. God thirsts so that we might have thirst for Him. Okay, so by nature, man is a praying being, right? So if prayer is something that man naturally does, then there's a virtue attached to it, right? So the virtue helps us to fulfill that particular aspect of our nature. Um, and so we can't ever forget that prayer really is a gift that God gives us, but it's a means, right? It's a means in which our thirst collides with God's thirst. It's a means by which we come to see God face to face, right? And it's a means by which we taste a little bit of what heaven will be like. Yes, Casey.
Can you define prayer?
Yeah. So prayer is the lifting of the heart and the mind to God. That just very simply. Um, and you could go deeper than that, but I would say that's as simple as it gets. Connor, go for it.
So I've heard people say, so prayer is a gift. I've heard it, I guess, maybe brought so far as to say that we cannot pray without grace or something like that. What does that mean in practice? Is it truly how does that differ from the fact that we can't do, strictly speaking, anything without God?
Yeah. So the aspect of prayer being a gift is the particularly unique way in which Christians pray, right? So the pagan, insofar as he naturally knows God as like creator of the universe, he can honor and pray to God. Um, but as prayer as this personal encounter with the triune God, um, that is a gift, right? And it's certainly a gift um, that comes, like St. Paul says in Romans, right? Like we don't know how to pray as we ought, so the Holy Spirit has to intercede for us. So it is a gift, um, and um, that's all I'm going to say about it until we get sort of through it. But does that sort of answer your question as far as
If
like?
I can ask one follow-up, is it
Yeah.
a habitual or actual grace?
It would be an actual grace. And everyone sort of know the difference between the two. Actual grace is what sort of moves us to do something that God wants us to do, where habitual grace would be like sanctifying grace um, would be the life of God within us. So it's a means by which habitual grace grows within us. To
Follow
answer
up to
your
the
question.
follow up. Is that the case even for the like perpetual higher levels of prayer?
Yes.
Okay.
So they are not. They can't be sort of. If it were habitual, you could just sort of do it on command, right? But you can't. It still requires that gift. Um, and I mean, as you'll see as we talk about it, really what our role is to get out of the way, in the sense that we need to find all of our defects and then grow in the virtues that do away with those defects, so that that grace that comes to lift us up, that wind that wants to get under our sails, has no impediments to it, and that's when you're lifted to higher and higher levels of prayer, right? So when the actual grace comes, when you've been perfected, uh, it's just you're just responding to the grace that's been coming all along. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Saint Teresa's sort of her categories of prayer. And the reason why these categories matter is for Saint Teresa, Saint John of the Cross, the same way. They look at prayer and the level of holiness as two things that go together. Okay. They go side by side. So as we grow in holiness, we grow in prayer, right? Specifically for the reason that I just said. Okay. Um, so we're going to talk about, even though there's 9 levels of prayer, we're going to really just talk about the first 3, really, and we'll just barely talk about 4, because the first 3 are what we can do. All right, what God, Saint Teresa would say, God infallibly gives us the actual grace to do these things um, whenever we sort of choose to. Whereas 4 and above, we are, those are infused gifts from God. Um, so what the first 3 do is sort of prepare us to receive the gift of, like, the full gift of prayer, the gift of contemplation, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about each one of these things, um, and so this is why I think we talked about this last week. This is why the earliest levels of prayer come with the most sort of demonic temptations with them, because once a person grows to a certain level of prayer, uh, they are pretty much off limits during their prayer time, because they are completely and totally operating under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And so that's why you should expect in the beginning levels of prayer for it to be an absolute battle, right? And this is why, the sort of the idea that Screwtape sets out this battleground, where there's a battleground in his mind, and he desires to really keep us from reaching contemplation. Okay. All right. So vocal prayer is just prayer with attention. We're going to come back to each one of these. So it's just prayer with attention to what one is saying or reading, and to God, the one we're addressing. Discursive meditation is consideration of some spiritual truth, applying it to oneself, and then resolve to do something about it. And then the prayer of recollection is when you sort of turn to the other, namely God, and prayer becomes this sort of loving back and forth between God and the soul, and with this sort of growing awareness of God's presence during the time of prayer. So it sort of gets to where it becomes very difficult to even have words. All right. So and then the infused recollection, that's when we get into sort of the higher levels of prayer, which I think later on in the book we'll talk a little bit about them, but it's important for us, I think, to understand the sort of beginning levels, because it really helps us to understand where we're at, right? Because if I've been doing discursive meditation for a while, and then all of a sudden I hit this gigantic wall, I'm like, well, I got to get back. All right, so let me try meditating on this book. All right, I'm not getting anything. I can't do anything. It may not be you're doing anything wrong. It's that God is calling you up to the next level. All right, and it's not a matter of like you get moved to a level and then you stay there for very often. God will pull you up and then you'll go back a little bit, and God will pull you up and you'll go back a little bit. And that's the point about whoever asked the question about, is like the higher levels of contemplation habitual? No. Like, Saint Teresa of Avila, even when she reached the highest levels of prayer, still had to do discursive meditation at times, or still did vocal prayer at times. So we don't ever leave the lower methods sort of behind. All right. So again, this a little bit vague at first, but as we get into sort of the examples, we can talk a little bit more about it. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to back up to vocal prayer for a second, because I think what Screwtape says there about where he says, what does he say? This be done by encouraging him to remember or think he remembers the parrot-like nature of his prayers in childhood. In reaction against that, he may be persuaded to aim at something entirely spontaneous, inward, informal, and unregularized. Right. So we have this tendency of think, well, rote prayer is bad, spontaneous inward prayer good, whereas neither is the case, right? Spontaneous inward prayer maybe when it's heart to heart, but rote prayer is just as good. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to use vocal prayer and how to use it properly. Okay. Again, here's what the Catechism says: vocal prayer is an essential element of the Christian life. To his disciples drawn by their master's silent prayer, Jesus teaches a vocal prayer, right? So when they come to him, they're like, Master, teach us how to pray. And he gives them the Our Father. He not only prayed aloud the liturgical prayers of the synagogue, but as the Gospels show, he raised his voice to express his personal prayer from exultant blessing of the Father to the agony of Gethsemane. All right. So the reason why it's the first sort of way into prayer is because it's the easiest, because you have the material to get your mind going. All right. But vocal prayer, when done correctly, is meant to take. So normally when we speak, right, we when we say something, we're expressing our thoughts. So thought sort of precedes word, right? But when we use vocal prayer, especially rote prayers or the Psalms, what we really want to do is make the word precede our thoughts. And so then we wrap our heart around those words, right? And so that's what makes the Psalms, especially early on in the spiritual life, as sort of a way to pray. It's almost like a school of prayer, in that it takes us and it helps us to wrap our hearts around the words, and the ideas and the ways in which God sort of praises himself, right? So it says something about God in words he's written, And so that's the power of vocal prayers. It teaches us, right? And so so Saint Teresa really in her own life really struggled with mental prayer. And so she used vocal prayer for a long time. In fact, when you read the book The Way of Perfection, the second half of it is basically just sort of an extended commentary on the Our Father. And you almost get the sense that she's showing you how she used praying the Our Father to go deeper and deeper into spiritual life. And so she says, okay, if you're really struggling with mental prayer, start with vocal prayer and really focus on what you're saying. Um, but focus in the sense of your focus shouldn't be just on the words, but first and foremost on who you're talking to. All right. So she would say something like, okay, uh, you're praying the Our Father, and you get to the word Father, and you realize, wow, like the God of the universe has told me to call him Father, and that opens up a whole pathway to prayer, right? And that opens up your heart to be able to begin to speak, right? And so what she really says is when you're praying vocal prayers, the emphasis is not so much on the formula, but on the one you're speaking to. And so she says, and the way to do that is to pick a single concept or concepts, and if you get stuck on it, then you get stuck on it, right? You just stay there with that. You stay with, God as Father. Um, you stay in the Hail Mary with Mother of God, realizing that, again, what God has done through Mary and what he continues to do. And that opens up your heart to begin to have that sort of loving contemplation and that loving conversation with God. Okay. And so there is a value then to this idea of vocal prayer, and not seeing it in a way that is that you have to come up with your own prayers. You got to be creative. I think it's Casey that, when I ask him to pray sometimes, he's like, the church has all these great prayers, right? Why would I try to invent a new one, right? Because it says what I want it to say. And yeah, Casey, I know you're pretty shocked that I just complimented you. But I tried to think if it was somebody else, but it was definitely you. um, but no, that's a beautiful truth. Look, there he is. He's got his prayer before study, right? He's like, okay, it's time for me to enter into study. St. Thomas Aquinas, the most studious man who ever lived. Why would I not just replicate what he did and then wrap my heart around like his ideas? Okay. All right. So St. Teresa of Avila says this then about vocal prayer. Um, she says, to keep you from thinking that little is gained through a perfect recitation of vocal prayer, I tell you that it's very possible that while you are reciting the Our Father or some other vocal prayer, the Lord may raise you to perfect contemplation. All right. So don't necessarily shy away from vocal prayer. All right. Don't sort of think, well, this is really childish, because that's a ploy of the devil, right? Like, again, they go to Jesus. They're like, hey, can you teach us how to pray? What does he give them? Well, he gives them meat to really meditate on, but he does give them a vocal prayer, right? Um, and so if you are struggling with mental prayer, just sort of back up to vocal prayer. Um, and this is something a lot of the saints do. And I think in a lot of ways, we have this sort of mass like cultural ADD where we really have trouble, with this barrage of images and setting our imagination, being able to control our imagination. Um, and a lot of people give up prayer for that. They're like, look, I sit down and do mental prayer for 20 minutes and I'm getting nothing out of it. I can't do anything because my mind is racing everywhere. Okay, just back up to vocal prayer, right? Um, and so St. Teresa says, don't give up prayer just on that account of that. She's like, just focus on, just spend a little more time focusing on vocal prayer, right? Um, and it's also a really good practice to back up to vocal prayer when you're dry, right? Because now you're taking, again, the words and ideas of someone else, and using them as a launching pad for a conversation with God, right? You simply just can't find words, and nothing is bringing you any sort of consolation to be able to even speak to God. Like, back up to the Psalms. Um, and so, the end. Remember what the purpose of prayer, right? Is like, prayer is essentially like a foretaste of heaven, right? Like, that's what we're going to be doing for all eternity, right? Like, we're going to see God face to face. And now we see him through the sort of the darkness of faith, right? And so this sort of collision of our heart with God's heart. And so when, when that happens, when we speak directly to God and he speaks back to us, the our prayer level will go up, right? But it has to be at the same time, which we talked about last week, how virtue and prayer have to go hand in hand, right? Because they're both means to sanctity. Like, you're not going to get a person who is, sort of habitually in sin climbing to the highest level of prayer, right? Because they don't have the sanctity. They couldn't handle it. Um, and um, and so it's a twofold thing, and that's why these first few letters from Lewis really sort of kind of vacillate between like attacks against virtue and attacks against prayer, attacks against virtue and attacks against prayer, because those are the two things that they're in sort of the beginning of the spiritual life are the most important, and we have to focus on those. Like, we focus exclusively on winning virtue to get everything out of the way. We focus exclusively on growing in prayer, so that God can then give us the gifts that we've given, that we've strived so hard to win the virtues for. Okay, so they're both remember, they're means to the end of sanctity. Okay, we can't forget that. Okay, so that's vocal prayer. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about mental prayer. Okay. St. Teresa says, now you understand the difference that lies between perfect contemplation and mental prayer. Mental prayer consists of what was explained, being aware and knowing that we are speaking with whom we are speaking, and who we ourselves are who dare to speak so much with so great a Lord. All right, so sort of imprint that on your mind, what she just said right there, because what she did is define mental prayer, right? And again, what she says is, she says, okay, mental prayer is this growing, or this being aware and knowing that we're speaking to God, who we're speaking to, and who we are, that we're able to speak to God. Like, just the idea of that, the idea that that somehow we are able to connect to the one who's created everything, right? And the one who, the same one who climbed the hill of Calvary and died for us, we can talk to him. The same one who came down upon the church as like tongues of fire, we can speak directly to him, and we have his attention whenever we seek it. Okay. To think about this and other similar things of how little we have served him and how much we are obliged to serve him is mental prayer. All right. So remember, we talked last week about when we pray, it's really important to be honest in our prayer, right? So we just go in and go, look, like, I know that I am essentially a fugitive from hell, and I'm living on borrowed time, like, and being honest, and I don't want to be that way, but only you can heal me from that, right? And so she's saying the beginning of prayer is a lot of that, right? Of how little we have served him and how much we are obligated to serve him in his mental prayer. Don't think it amounts to some other kind of gibberish. And don't let the name frighten you. To recite the Our Father, or Hail Mary, or whatever prayers you wish is vocal prayer. But behold what prayer music you produce when you do this without mental prayer, right? So she's saying, like, even our vocal prayer has to somehow become mental prayer, all right? And so to just sort of parrot prayers isn't good, right? And so we ultimately have to then keep reminding ourselves who we're talking to and who we are that's talking to God, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about sort of the two forms of mental prayer that I had there on the list. And so here's what Saint Teresa says. She says, if you are happy, what she's talking about here is the best way to pray is to link our lives with Christ's life. Okay, to link our life with Christ's earthly life. Because what is our ultimate goal? What's our ultimate goal? Why do we even bother all of this, right? Is to become just like Christ. And so what she's sort of inviting us to and calling us to is to take our current state and match it up with a mystery in Christ's life, and then grab the graces that he won during that mystery for us, and then to emulate him so that we can become holier. All right. So she's saying, if you are happy, look upon your risen Lord and the very thought of how he rose from the sepulchre will gladden you. How bright and how beautiful was he then, how majestic, how victorious, how joyful. He was like one emerging from a battle in which he had gained a great kingdom, all of which he desires you to have, and with it himself. All right, so this idea of, well, if I come to prayer and I'm in a joyful mood, well, then I should meditate on something that's joyful, right? I should meditate on something in Christ's life that's joyful, right? Because ultimately, all of our prayer, all the graces we'll win from our prayer, Christ already won for us, right? And so what we need to do is to go into those mysteries in which he won those graces for us, and take them, all right? And she says, if you are, where am I at here? If you are suffering trials or are sad, look upon him on his way to the garden, or look upon him bound to the column, full of pain, his flesh all torn to pieces by his great love for you. How much he suffered, persecuted by some, spat upon by others, denied by his friends, and even deserted by them, with none to take his part, frozen with the cold, and left so completely alone that you may well comfort each other. Or look upon him bending under the weight of the cross and not even allowed to take breath. He will look upon you with his lovely and compassionate eyes full of tears, and in comforting your grief, will forget his own, because you are bearing him company in order to comfort him and turning your head to look upon him. All right, so this goes back to, I think we've talked about this before, about, when Christ was in the garden, right, what he suffered was because he saw all of our sins, all right? But what comforted him was he saw all of the good things that would come from what he did, right? And he could do that because he was God, all right? And so if he could do that in the garden, he could do it at every moment of his life, where every single moment of his life, because he's God, the eternal God who sees all things at once, he saw each one of us. And so he knew what graces we would need when we would need them, and he won them for us, right? And so when he was on the Mount of Transfiguration, he knew what graces that Casey and Connor and Brendan and John Claude would need today, right? And he won them for them, all right? And so we were always in his mind, always before him, right? And so this idea then is not unique to Saint Teresa of Avila, of connecting to the mysteries of Christ's life. This is why we pray the Rosary, by the way, and we look at the mysteries of Christ's life. Is we go into the events as if we were there, because we were there, we were in his mind, and we go and we get the graces that he was going to give us. All right, and so this act then of meditating in that way, in which we go to the actual event in Christ's life and we meditate upon that event, that's why we do that. We do that because we were there, right? And we were there, and we may have been, at any given time, we could go back to the Transfiguration 2 days later. Well, Christ knew we'd be back 2 days later, and he knew that on that day he was going to give you this grace, right? And so all we're trying to do in our prayer is get to those moments where we seize the graces that he was going to give us. Okay, and so that makes praying, especially the Gospels, a little bit easier, I think. I think it makes it easier because I go into this Gospels passage, and my first question to Christ is, well, what did you have in mind for me when this was going on? What were you trying to give me today when this was going on, right? And that's what Saint Teresa is getting at, all right? And she's getting at having this conversation with Christ, and it starts just on a simple level, right? It may simply have been, when he goes into the, you go into the garden with Christ, and he's like, oh, today I won for you the perseverance in prayer, because not all your prayers are going to be answered, right? And that's what he won for you, and so you're back tomorrow for that reason, right? And so we should go to Christ expecting something, because he already won something for us, right? But expecting too that we may not grasp what it totally is. And so that idea, then, that's why mental prayer is so important, and why it's such an important beginning, all right? And why it's so important, St. Teresa is saying, very first thing you do, put yourself in God's presence, put yourself in the eternal presence of God, right? He's before us all the time, right? But we turn our attention to him, right? And then, if we're going to meditate on a gospel passage, we turn and put our attention to Christ in that moment during his earthly life. And so she says, come with, again, why do we make the sign of the cross, right? We make the sign of the cross to remind ourselves who we belong to and whose presence we're now in. All right. And so she says, okay, come before God, and, make an act of faith, make a act of hope, make an act of charity, make an act of contrition, because suddenly when I'm in the presence of God, even though I don't feel it, I don't feel his holiness, I realize my own unworthiness. And so I make an act of contrition, or examine my conscience, right? Or some people even, just pray a come Holy Spirit prayer. The point is we've got to do something before we step in, to remind ourselves who God is and who we are. And then St. Teresa says, well, a lot of people waste their time in prayer because they forget this simple step, right? They just try to jump right into it, right? Don't jump right into it. And if it takes 10 minutes to make that act, make the act anyway, right? Because again, what's the goal of prayer? The goal of prayer, especially in the early stages, is to be constantly aware of God's presence, right? To be constantly aware that He is with me. And so she says, again, always a realist. She's like, if you're going to speak to someone, you got to get near them. You can't yell from afar, and you can't just start talking when you don't know that they're being attentive to you, right? Because God may have something to say to us. And so she's like, turn your attention to him, let him know that he has your attention, and then go. Okay. Later on in the letter, so what we talked about earlier was sort of the facts of prayer, the way and what prayer does. Lewis also does a good job of giving us what I think is another trap. And this was when I said, this particular letter struck me at a time. This was what got me. Was what I will call the feelings of prayer. He says the simplest is to turn their gaze away from him towards themselves. Keep them watching their own minds and trying to produce feelings there by the action of their own wills. When they meant to ask him for charity, let them instead start trying to manufacture charitable feelings for themselves and not notice that this is what they're doing. When they are meant to pray for courage, let them really be trying to feel brave. When they say they are praying for forgiveness, let them be trying to feel forgiven. Teach them to estimate the value of each prayer by their success in producing the desired feeling. And never let them suspect how much success or failure of that kind depends on whether they are well or ill, fresh or tired at the moment. Right. So this kind of speaks for itself, but the point is when you go and you make an act of contrition, for example, if you feel sorry, great. If you don't, the act of contrition is still an act of the will, right? When you're asking God for forgiveness. And very often, because of what Lewis is getting at here, God will not allow you to have those feelings that go with it, all right? Because we can sort of because they feel good, right? Even the sorrow that we have for sins, when we actually have sorrow, it feels good. And we get sort of attached to the feelings or tempted by the feelings or tempted to focus only on the feelings, right? And so again, when you go and you make an act of contrition and you don't feel sorry, just offer God Our Lady's tears, right? Or the tears of Jesus at the grave of Lazarus, right? Like that's what we're supposed to do. That's the idea of being priests in that sense, is that we can offer that, and being part of the communion of saints, we can offer Our Lady's tears, right? And those are far more pleasing to God than any tears I could possibly manufacture, right? And ultimately, if that's what we're trying to do, right, we're trying to ultimately not give ourselves satisfaction, but to give God satisfaction, then we can sort of rely on those. Okay, and this we'll talk a little bit more about the communion of saints in probably 2 or 3 weeks when we get to that letter. But that's the idea, right? Where the saints sort of share their merits, especially Our Lady. And so if you don't feel sorry, that's fine. Just offer Our Lady's tears instead. One other thing he goes into, there's 2 more things in this letter we're going to talk about. He says, at the very least, they can be persuaded that the bodily positions make no difference to their prayers, for they constantly forget what you must always remember, that they are animals and that whatever their bodies do affects their souls. It is funny how mortals always picture us putting things into their minds. In reality, our best work is done by keeping them out. Right? So as Catholics, we should grasp this, but I think there's sort of a movement away from it, like it's almost like a spiritualism a little bit, where we think, well, as long as I'm praying, like spiritually, it doesn't really matter if I'm laying in my bed, if I'm, running on the treadmill, if I'm driving the car, or if I'm on my knees. It just doesn't matter. Um, and as soon as you like say it, you realize, okay, hold on, that if we are really bodily creatures, right, and bodily actions dispose our souls, right, to have certain to sort of put our souls in certain positions, right, especially the position to receive grace. We begin to think about, well, maybe posture actually matters, right? Well, maybe praying on my knees matters versus laying down, being as comfortable as I can, right? Because again, it's hard to sit, it's hard to go and pray and recognize who God is, and when you're not standing at attention, right, or you're not attentive to Him, you're just sort of laying around. Um, and again, that doesn't mean you don't pray while you're laying down, but it certainly means like, okay, it's time for me to pray. I don't go lay down. Okay, so here's what Pope Benedict says in his book Spirit of Liturgy. It says, it may well be that kneeling is alien to modern culture. You could substitute anything here, like standing. If you want a good meditation or a good set of meditations on prayer posture, Saint Dominic there's 9 of them, his 9 postures. They were written by his followers, I think, shortly after his death. It was basically the 9 ways they used to see him pray. And if you want to be sort of moved and realize how just important posture is, like those are good meditations to have. Um, anyway, so he says, okay, it may well be that kneeling is alien to modern culture insofar as it is a culture. For this culture is turned away from the faith and no longer knows the one before whom kneeling is the right, indeed the intrinsically necessary gesture. All right, so what he's really sort of getting at here is the idea that culture first and foremost starts with cult, right? Obviously, and so can you really call something a culture when it has when the virtue of religion is lacking? All right. So he says the one before whom kneeling is the right, indeed the intrinsically necessary gesture. So he's calling the idea of kneeling before God an intrinsically necessary gesture. And we'll talk in a second about why that might be. The man who learns to believe learns also to kneel, and a faith or a liturgy no longer familiar with kneeling would be sick at the core. Whether it has been lost, kneeling must be rediscovered so that in our prayer we remain in fellowship with the apostles and martyrs, in fellowship with the whole cosmos, indeed in union with Jesus Christ himself. All right, so he sort of lets us on to why he says something like seems a little extreme at first, intrinsically necessary gesture, right? And he gives us some of the reasons why. Well, because that's how the apostles prayed. That's how Stephen prayed before he was stoned to death. That's how Jesus, when he prayed, right? And so not only do we, again, going back to what I said about the graces that God gives us, right? There are graces to be given to us simply by kneeling in union with Christ, to stepping into Christ, because all of our prayer is just stepping into Jesus's prayer, right? And to go into, when he went up in the mountain by him, up in the hills by himself, we can go and we can kneel beside him, right? And win graces simply by kneeling, by being in his presence and adopting his same posture, all right? And of course, like kneeling is not just, it obviously isn't, the external act itself is not worth anything. But what it does is it disposes us to what Christ wants to give us. All right. And so when we're on our knees, like we are weak, right? Like you can't really, there's not a whole lot you can do when you're on your knees. But interestingly enough, the Hebrew word for kneeling actually implies strength. And the reason is because when you kneel and you become weak, you recognize where your strength is, right? And that has to happen. That can't just happen spiritually, it has to happen bodily. And so our bodily posture absolutely matters, all right? And so Pope Benedict gets this idea from what he calls the theology of kneeling, which he gets from the 2nd chapter of Philippians, okay? Where, it says that every knee will bend before Christ, okay? And so it's almost as if, okay, that's the fundamental response to Christ the King, is to kneel. right? And that sort of makes sense, right? And then Eusebius in his church history has a couple of really kind of cool examples. So he's talking about James the apostle, um, who was sort of purported to have calluses on his knees from kneeling so much. And then he also talks about later on, and he talks about one of the desert fathers has this vision of a demon, and the demon has no knees. Like that's all he can remember about it, right? Because he's incapable of praying, right? And so this demon has no knees. So when we come to prayer on our knees, it's immediately an act of humility, right? Because I don't kneel before anybody else but God, right? And even you see like in if you're aware of it, there's a lot in St. Paul's letters about kneeling, right? Like he says, I kneel before the Father, and he gives this prayer, or from all fatherhood in Ephesians, where he talks about we're the root of all fatherhood. And so this symbolic sort of symbolic gesture of humility actually helps us to grow in humility, okay? Because to kneel is sort of humiliating in a certain sense, right? To go before someone is to say, you are above me, right? And then again, the idea of this sort of showing this lack of strength, okay? All right, so posture matters. Again, does it need to be kneeling? Not necessarily. Does it need to be, can it be standing at times? Yes. Can it be sitting at times? Yes. Right. But I would say if you if you are in the habit of daily mental prayer, set aside a certain area in your house and use that as your prayer area, right? Just use that where you're going to pray, and it sends a message to your body that it's time to pray, right? I mean, I even have one right here, like just a kneeler with a simple crucifix right at eye level, that all I can do is look at the crucifix. And I know when I kneel down there that it's time, like, and that in and of itself almost sets me into God's presence. All right. So get in a habit of doing that. Okay. All right. Next, Lewis talks about sacramentals, although he doesn't, not being Catholic, he doesn't realize he's really talking about sacramentals.
It's hard to see that he wasn't Catholic when he's writing this book. I don't know, just reading it.
Yeah, so like high church Anglicans are pretty close, right? Like they're liturgically they're pretty close. So you will get a lot of things, like if you've ever read, like he has The Weight of Glory. He has this essay where he says, next to the Blessed Sacrament, like the holiest thing you'll see is your neighbor, right? And you get the sense that that he was really close. And if you know some of his history, when he was on his deathbed, J.R.R. Tolkien sent his son, who was a Catholic priest, to visit him, and it was a no-go. But it also probably stems from the fact that he grew up in Northern Ireland, where Catholics were absolutely horrible, and Protestants were too. But if you grew up in Northern Ireland at that time, getting over the way the Catholics treated the Protestants and vice versa would be really hard. So if he wasn't Catholic, he, God willing, is Catholic now. All right, so he talks about what I want to talk about is actually understanding the Catholic understanding of sacramentals. Again, using them as spiritual weapons. Okay, says I've known cases where what the patient called his God was actually located up and to the left at the corner of the bedroom ceiling, or inside his own head, or in a crucifix on the wall. But whatever the nature of the composite object, you must keep him praying to it, to the thing he has made, not to the person who has made him. So in one sense, obviously that's true. In one sense, if I just simply, if I look at the crucifix and I pray to it as if it is God, then there's no benefit to it, right? Or if I pray to the corner of the room as if God entered the room there and is up there, that again may not be that fruitful, right? So he has a certain sense. He's right. But by the same token, sacramentals, like a crucifix, have a power to them. So let's talk a little bit about this. So sacramentals are different than sacraments in the way sacraments infallibly give grace, right? Now, if it's received or not is different. So just by the virtue of what they are, they work what's called ex opere operato, by the work done. Sacramentals get their efficacy from the intercessory power of the church. All right. They don't give sanctifying grace, but they dispose the person to receive it. Okay. So so the efficacy of a sacramental depends on the blessing that's been bestowed upon it by the priest. All right. This is why when we ask to have an object blessed, the church has a whole book of blessings and certain ways in which things are supposed to be blessed, because each sacramental is meant to carry with it a specific power. Okay.
Rob,
Yes.
are all priests blessing equally effective?
Yeah. So it's not, the blessing is not because of the person. It would be because of the church, right? So Christ was the one who instituted the sacraments. The church institutes sacramentals. So the priest, regardless of what he's like, it wouldn't matter. But his prayer absolutely would matter as to, if for example he just goes over water and makes a sign of the cross, um, and doesn't actually bless the water, using one of the formulas of the church. Well, now holy water, which has the power because of the prayer that the church normally attaches to it to forgive venial sins, doesn't do that anymore, right? So the efficacy is always in the prayer itself, and always because of the power of the church. All right. And so when you get something blessed, like make sure that they're actually blessing it correctly. All right. So when a Saint Benedict medal, for example, gets blessed, like it really does have the power to protect the person from the devil. Okay. When the person is under spiritual attack, they can run to the Saint Benedict medal and it actually stops them. Or palms are a great example, right? Like if palms receive the blessing that they've been given, and you put them in your house, they really do protect your house from natural disasters. Okay. So obviously, I mean, the St. Benedict medal is an example, right, of just a sort of a powerful sacramental that when you go to them actually does something, right? And St. Louis de Montfort as an example of a guy who was being sort of tormented by the devil, and the devil meets him and is going to throw him off a cliff, but then sees that he has a scapular on, and he's like, I can't touch him, right? And so this idea that the sacramentals actually have a power and an efficacy of their own. And also what's really important is that understanding what they do and what they don't do, right? So when I go, when I go before the crucifix, a blessed crucifix, it actually, makes present to me, the power of the cross, right? And that keeps them from becoming something like good luck charms, right? Because they're not that. Okay. The Saint Benedict medal is not going to help me win the lottery. All right. The burying of the Saint Joseph statue is not going to make me sell my house. But having a Saint Joseph statue in my house will certainly protect the people in it. Right. Okay. So get in a habit of using sacramentals, holy water, blessed salts, crucifixes. We have a crucifix in pretty much every room in our house. And it's not just for the reason of like, yeah, I walk into the room, I see the crucifix, it reminds me, and it gives me an opportunity to give a one breath prayer, but because of what that blessed crucifix actually does. Okay. And for the same reason, we have like a holy water font in our house, because occasionally I will go and I will remind myself of my baptism, and work, for forgiveness of venial sins. So where does this idea come from? St. Thomas Aquinas talks about it. There is whoever had the St. Thomas quote square, here it is. It says, the infusion of grace is not necessary for the blotting out of venial sin. So he's asking, he's like, okay, why do we have to have sacramentals? And specifically, he's talking about why do we have to have holy water? It says, the infusion of grace is not necessary for the blotting out of venial sin. Wherefore, since grace is infused in each of the sacraments in the new law, none of them was instituted directly against venial sin. This is taken away by certain sacramentals, for instance, holy water and such like. And so he says that the power of holy water has this power when it's been blessed because of the blessing, right? So the priest will say something like, he'll talk about the living water of salvation, and he'll say the grant that anyone who's sprinkled by this water will be refreshed inwardly by the power of the Holy Spirit, and continue to walk in the same newness of life of baptism. So it's like this refreshing, we bless ourselves with holy water. It's this refreshing encounter with our baptism. So the crucifix, again, a crucifix, there's a reason why like the exorcists usually have crucifixes in their hands, right? Because the blessing, especially in the 1962 Roman ritual book, actually talks about protecting all of those who gaze upon it from the cruel darts of the enemy. All right.
So, question.
Yes.
My typical experience, and I'm guessing this is the case for everyone, is when I take a thing to a priest to bless it, he makes the sign of the cross over it and says, like, "Can please, like, bless this so that," and then makes up something. How efficacious is that? And should we like seek a priest that will use the blessing in the Roman ritual itself?
Yeah, I think if you're going to use the item in the nature that in the way it's intended to be used, I would make sure they bless it correctly.
Okay.
What I've done before, like I had rosary beads that I wanted someone to bless that I was giving to someone as a gift, and it had a Saint Benedict medal on it, which requires a special blessing. I actually went to the priest after Mass and I said, "Can you bless this?" And here I've pulled up the special blessing for the Saint Benedict prayer. So some of it is just a matter. Some of it is an educational thing. Some of it is just a matter of what they don't walk around with their Roman ritual book and go, "Hey, this is how the blessing is supposed to go." But again, I think we've talked about this before. But being in a room with an exorcist, they use sacramentals a lot, right? They use crucifixes. They use images of saints. They use icons. And they they do have a power, and they are effective, and the devil does not like them. And so if you feel like you're under attack, go bless yourself with holy water. You go into a place like hotel rooms are a good example. Like we go into a hotel room, we throw blessed salts in each of the room, right? I don't know what's gone on before there. I don't want anything leaving with me, right? In fact, there is a guy, I think I've shared this story before. There's a guy who that I work with, whose office is around the corner, who had all this Freemasonry stuff in his office. And I just walked by one day when he wasn't there, and I just threw a bunch of blessed salts in there. And within a week, all the Freemasonry stuff was out of the office. So they have a sort of this power all their own. Okay. So that's sacramentals.
Rob,
Yes.
I wonder if you can, because one time I told a priest, I was like, oh, I did something similar where I was like, there was like a coworker who had like Hindu stuff or something. I threw blessed salt down, and he's like, oh, you better be careful about retaliation. But there's a prayer against retaliation. He didn't really go into any more detail, but like, I don't know. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. So was he implying you shouldn't try to save someone's soul because the devil might fight back? Like what was
I think I don't know.
He was saying it might be dangerous for Kevin to do so. I don't know. It was kind of a warning, and I think it was someone you might trust. So
yeah. So you do need to be careful about retaliation. That is a real thing. But what I would recommend is pray against retaliation, because like in my case, it wasn't necessarily that I was looking to free that person, because it was more the sense of, well, I was looking to free the environment which I go into regularly, and so I felt like I had a certain amount of almost a certain amount of authority because I'm in there all the time to protect myself and so forth. So yeah, you do have to be a little bit careful, but I wouldn't hesitate because of retaliation. I would absolutely, as long as you're not going, and this is sort of getting us far afoot, but not going beyond the authority, like you're not doing something that requires more authority than you have, then you're probably okay. But definitely praying prayers of against retaliation are a good idea.
What are prayers against retaliation, though? Like what? Like just.
Yeah. So there are actually formulas, which basically just asking God to blind the devil to whatever you're doing.
Thanks, Casey.
All right. Did Casey share it? Okay.
I think, Rob, could you, it seems like you're mentioning this Roman ritual book a lot. Is that like, that sounds kind of like the book for the like blessings and stuff like that?
Yeah. So it's the 1962 Roman ritual book. Has all of the prayers in Latin, and they're much richer than when they were rewritten. I don't remember what year they were rewritten. And so a lot of priests will use them for that reason, because they're still valid. And especially when they're blessing things. So if you know someone that blesses things that way, like that, that's definitely the preferred way. Not as if a blessing from in another way is bad, but.
So is that blessing like in the Latin like 1962 version like more effective than the like more recent one, or?
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, it's not because it's in Latin. Don't let me get wrong. It's
okay.
It's because of what it actually says, right? So they've simplified them greatly. Like I don't think you would find the blessing of a crucifix now. I don't think has that same blessing where it says against the cruel darts of the enemy.
From my understanding, there's just a general now like blessing of religious artifacts that most priests use, and it's just like one sentence long.
Yeah.
General blessing of.
Yeah, this is definitely like I don't know the ins and outs of. I just know several priests that use that ritual book, and I usually will ask them to bless stuff for that reason.
So can you do thing re-blessed if it was blessed poorly / improperly?
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, you can even, if you're not even sure, like we'll buy something and I'm like, I don't remember getting that blessed, and I may have. I mean, they can, it's they can do it conditionally too. Okay. All right. So moving on. So that's letter 4. Let's move on to letter 5. So letter 5 there's a lot in there, but what I want to sort of focus on is so this is the part where the war is beginning, and they're sort of discussing, okay, how can we use the war against the patient, right? And so it says, consider to what undesirable deaths occur in wartime. Men are killed in places where they know they might be killed, and to which they go. Hold on a second. Men are killed in places where they knew they might be killed, and to which they go. If they are all at our enemy's party prepared, how much better for us if all humans died in costly nursing homes amid doctors who lie, nurses who lie, friends who lie, as we have trained them, promising life to the dying, encouraging the belief that sickness excuses every indulgence, and even if our workers know their job, withholding all suggestion of a priest lest it should betray to the sick man his true condition. And how disastrous for us is the continual remembrance of death, which war enforces. One of our best weapons, contented worldliness, is rendered useless. In wartime, not even a human can believe that he's going to live forever, right? So this, I think, is a relatively new phenomenon. I think because of the general state of our health and the way that how long we tend to live now. It used to be that people remembered death, right? And we didn't have to tell them remember death. But I think it's really important in your spiritual life because death is really the most important moment of your life is when you die, right? So the whole meaning of life is to die well. And I don't mean to be morbid about that, but and we're going to talk about this when we get to the very last letter, when it's talking about the sort of final temptations that come at us. There's a reason why we have to have St. Joseph's help as the terror of demons. How the onslaught at the moment of death is so bad that if you're not prepared, that it's very difficult to withstand. So that there's the spiritual warfare aspect of it. But dying well is also important because after Christ dying on the cross, death is now something that we offer to God, right? And so it's in fact, really the only thing that is totally ours that we can offer to God, right? And so dying well, dying in union with Christ, is something we should all strive to do, right? Strive to die well. But what that really requires is us to have the courage to meditate on death. All right. So like Saint Robert Bellarmine has a book called The Art of Dying Well. Um, and obviously if it's an art, it's something that is practiced, right? And so it's not like, 40 Ways to Die, or he's like jumping off cliffs, but it's actually taking it to prayer, and remembering your death, right? Um, and the first temptation then is what Screwtape's talking about is the devil will try to get you to have this sort of mode of distraction, where it always sits in the back of our minds, but something we're just gonna have to deal with later, right? Like, I'm not there yet, I don't have to worry about that. And we sort of come up with creative ways not to have to think about it. I think it's like Pascal talks about running heedlessly, into the abyss, like putting something into our face and then running off a cliff and not even realizing it, to stop us from seeing it. And then we just sort of hope, well, when the moment comes, hopefully I'll be asleep and I'll it'll just be peaceful, right? So there's this idea of just distraction, right? And then there's the sort of pop psychology approach to it, which says, yeah, like you just got to accept death. It's just something you have to accept. And so it becomes like this sort of, the twin to taxes, right? Where we treat it as something to be sort of just planned around, and ultimately, hopefully we can cheat it as long as possible, right? That's why death and taxes sort of always go together. We're trying to cheat on both. But the book of Sirach says that we should remember the last things and you will never sin. Remember that death is always around the corner. And that's remember in the biblical sense, right? So remember doesn't just mean, oh yeah, I need to think about that today. It's, remembrance in the biblical sense means to make it a present reality, right? Like it comes like a thief in the night and we have to be prepared for it. All right. And so don't be fearful about, meditating upon death, because the fear of death is what, that's the thing that makes us Christians, right? Like if you look at the rest of the world versus like true Catholics and their response to the coronavirus, everyone is scared of death. A Catholic shouldn't be scared of death, right? Because we know we know and worship the one and who's become our friend and our judge and who conquered death, right? He just ran right over the top of it. Like we don't have anything to fear. That was the only, like the book of Hebrews says, like that's the devil's only weapon is fear of death. And if you take that out of his hands, right? And so we have to confront the fact that we're going to die, but not just to accept it, but to strive to die well, right? So each night when you go to bed, pray for a happy death. Pray that you die well. And that's the way that it becomes an art, okay? Because life really isn't pass fail, right? You have to run through, like St. Paul says, he's like, okay, I'm getting to the end, but I'm going to keep running. Like I'm going to run so as to win the race. We have to keep going and run right into the hands of God the Father. And so it's not a punishment. Like you're like, oh, I'm getting to death, and this is my last chance. This is my last thing to offer to God, and I want to do it well, right? And that is, by the way, the great evil of euthanasia, right? We deprive people of that. We deprive people of the ability to offer to God a beautiful death, right? And so that lie of it, good death, sweet death. Like, no, sweet death is one that's united to Christ that we give to him, right? And so we have to be ready for that. And the only way we're ready for that is to meditate on it, and the fear goes away, right? The fear goes away. And then, we're like St. Paul, right? Like St. Paul spent a lot of time doing it clearly because he said, well, whether I live and die, it's okay, whichever God wants, right? And that's a free man, right? That's a man who's free and can then, do whatever God is calling him to without fear, all right? And so, again, having the habit of meditating upon the last things, death, judgment, heaven, hell, that's an important spiritual weapon, all right? And so use it. You can see here in this letter how Screwtape is essentially saying, well, death is not really, the great weapon we think it is. And so you can just take it out of the hands of the devil by doing that. All right, last slide. Slipping ahead to actually I lied. I think there's one more slide. Last letter. So slipping ahead to letter 6. this letter is mostly about accepting God's will, but as it comes to us through His providence from moment to moment. Okay, so how God calls us, like Thy will be done, happens from moment to moment to moment. Right? It's not a big thing. It's the moment as we see it, how God has ordained things to be. We can either cooperate or not. All right, we can either, and in the sense that we can cooperate by saying Thy will be done, or go kicking and screaming. But either way, Thy will be done. Right. So he says, your patient will, of course, have picked up the notion that he must submit with patience to the enemy's will. What the enemy means by this is primarily that he should accept with patience the tribulation which has actually been dealt out to him, the present anxiety and suspense. So he's talking about the war, not knowing what's going on with the war. It is your business to see that the patient never thinks of the present fear as his appointed cross, but only of the things he is afraid of. For real resignation at the same moment to a dozen different and hypothetical fates is almost impossible, and the enemy does not greatly assist those who are trying to attain it. Resignation to present and actual suffering, even where that suffering consists of fear, is far easier and is usually helped by this direct action. All right, so what is he talking about? So he's talking about the fact that very often we're living off in the future at some point, and we're fearful of some theoretical evil that's coming, right? And the remedy to that is we can fear things like the coronavirus. We can fear, the threat that it is. But that's where we need to stop, right? That's the present cross, right? We can't go off and then write a story about how it's going to be, right? Because why? Well, essentially you're usurping God's role, right? He's the one who writes the story. And again, that's where the freedom is, because you can't pick up a hypothetical cross that's up in the future, right? You can pick up the cross of the fear of right now. And that's what Lewis is getting at here. He's saying, okay, look at the moment of what the cross is in the moment. And don't try to add to it or change it or make it something that it may or may not be. It's like you just take what's coming from the present moment, and Jesus, I trust in you for the rest of it, right? And that's how you accept God's will, right? Because a person can, and this is often something, a trap we can fall into, where we're scared to give God everything because of like what bad might happen, and then we think of the worst possible thing that could happen. It's like, okay, if I give God everything, He's going to make me and my family move to Zimbabwe, and we're going to live out in the woods with no bathrooms. And so we come to this extreme situation that obviously he's not even close to asking us that, right? And so this whole letter then is also about living in like hypothetical reality, and thinking about, well, I'm going to reserve from God, because if I tell God like I want to suffer with Him, well, oh, that's bad, because I could think of Him giving me stage 7 cancer, and I'm going to die from it, slow, painful death, right? And that's what happens, right? Whereas we just simply we give everything to God, including the future of just where it goes, and just wherever you want to take it, God, I'm not even going to think about it. Like, and that's what Jesus is talking about, right? When he says, like, consistent, what does he say? For today are enough. I forget how he says it, but essentially,
sufficient is the evil of one day.
Yes, thank you. Sufficient for today are the evils, right? Like, don't worry about the evils that are coming tomorrow. Just take what you have today, offer it back to God, and don't get stuck in sort of hypothetical land. And the devil will be there at your side to help you with that, right? And that is the source of most people's anxiety, right? Most people's anxiety aren't because of what's going on now, it's because of what it could turn into. All right. And so, like, don't let the devil pull you into that ploy. And the minute you go down that route, this is almost the message of divine mercy, right? Is like, I trust in Jesus's mercy, right? I'll just be like St. Therese, I'll be a victim of his love. Whatever that means, whatever he's going to give me, it's okay. Because for today, I'll just take this, because this is my cross today. All right. Then he talks about, in that letter, there's one more sort of hypothetical, and this has to deal with love of neighbor, and it's again just a subtle trick that the devil uses, right? Where I see this a lot in people who are sort of committed to social justice. What they'll do is they'll say, okay, I'll read the letter and then we'll talk about it. The great thing is to direct the malice to his immediate neighbors whom he meets every day, and to thrust his benevolence out to remote circumference of people he does not know. So this idea of like showing like love of neighbor in the abstract, but not in the particular, right? So one of the ways in which, you know, God's providence, like he reveals his will to us, is putting people in our path, right? And those people that he puts in our path are the people that we have to love, right? Not the people far away in, you know, remote Zimbabwe who don't have bathrooms. As tragic as that is, like that's not really our mission. We can't love them. We can only love them in the abstract. We can't love them in the particular, right? You know, it's really easy to love the people over there and then miss the people like right in front that God has put us. Like, you know, it's like the little kid standing in front of the TV, like trying to get his dad's attention, and you know, dad is like screaming at the kid, like, "Hey, I'm trying to, you know, learn about the starving people in Africa. Get out of the way, you little brat." Right? You have to love the people that God puts in front of you, right? And it reminds me of that the Chesterton quote, right, where he talks about the Bible tells us to love our neighbors and also tells us to love our enemies, probably because they're the same people, right? So people that are put in front of us are difficult to love, and God does that on purpose, right? And we can't run away from that and then go find people that are easy to love and people that are really needy. We have to go where God has led us. All right. So that's all I got. Questions?
Rob, did you ever consider being a deacon?
Did I ever consider being a deacon?
Would you? Future tense.
Oh, I did consider it. I don't think I'm called to that. Why did you ask that question?
I was just saying, I was telling Aaron, I was like, you said that's all you got. I was like, you just gave like 4 awesome homilies in a